And we're continuing our 24 by 24 broadcast live from Melbourne, Australia, with Rabbi Ian Goodhardt of Blake Street Hebrew Congregation. Rabbi Goodhardt, thank you for being with us.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. It's quite an experience to be speaking. I've got an audience here in my shul, and to be speaking to whoever's watching around the world on this streamed video. If you are watching on the computer, you're able to submit questions if you'd like to by using the form on the right-hand side of the video player. And you can also, and I suppose this applies to you in the hall, you can also submit questions by Twitter using the hashtags 24by24, that's 24x24, Jewish Learning, and Global Day. So if anyone is Twitter enabled in the hall, then you can do that, and by magic it will appear on my screen. So this is all tremendously exciting, and why don't I stop twittering and get on. Tonight I'll be speaking on the topic of creativity and Torah study. Every year when the Global Day comes around, as you know, in our shul we've been participating in the Global Day of Jewish Learning since its inception several years ago. And every day as the Global Day comes around, the organizers issue a curriculum, they issue a topic, and they issue themes on that topic, of which I've chosen this one, creativity and Torah study. So let me begin with a question. This session, it focuses on the place of individuality and creativity in the world of Jewish practice in general, and Torah study in particular. There is an idea, and this is really what this session is about, there is an idea that tradition and Jewish law are quite restrictive, and they dictate in very precise terms what a person should do, how a person should behave, and there is an idea that by so doing they eliminate any opportunity for creativity or difference or newness that a person might feel, because they say, well, we have to stick within the narrow lines of halakha. So the first question is this: does a commitment to tradition curtail individuality? For example, do you have a recipe that you make exactly how your grandmother made it? Do you ever adapt to it or add a personal touch? These are things where we have something that's handed down to us. It's laid out exactly how it should be done, but still it can be the same thing with our own personal spin. Another example, think about individual expression and whether rules and structure inhibit it or facilitate it. If you think of examples in your life, you may have experiences where you're part of a group or you're part of an organization which has rules, but nevertheless there's some flexibility and some freedom within those rules to be able to innovate and put your own personal stamp and personality on the way that you conduct yourself in that context. From the perspective of religion, because Judaism has many, many rules and many, many customs, some see it as the enemy of innovation. The many laws and regulations of Judaism, they seem to exacerbate this problem and create a kind of a stifling atmosphere that people sometimes feel that they can't give expression to their full selves within it. So what we want to do is try and illuminate the fact that that's not actually true as far as Judaism is concerned, that this alleged clash between tradition and personalization doesn't actually exist. On the contrary, we'll see towards the end that the opposite is actually the case. The truth is that tradition leaves plenty of room for individuality, and rules can change. Rules can actually encourage creativity. Now that may sound like a strange thing to say, that rules encourage creativity. So we'll have to see exactly how that operates and what I mean by that phrase. Think of other areas of life. Think of a sport. Think of football. Now, in Australia, we have our own brand of football, and despite the rumors that you may have heard, it does have rules. But within those rules, there is still room for expression, and there are like any sport, there are stars of the sport that have their own style and their own personality, their own particular way. They're all keeping to the same rules and they're all playing the same game, but they do so whilst finding within those rules the way in which they can give expression to their own personality and character. When I was a student, there was a lecturer in Jews College when I was training to be a rabbi. I would often find him making a copy of a recording of a symphony. He would be making a copy from one tape to another. In those days, we only had cassette tapes. And I would say to him, why do you not use the high-speed dubbing? Do you remember that marvelous invention, high-speed dubbing? Why do you not use that? And he said, because it loses the nuances that I'm looking for. I collect many, many recordings of the same symphony conducted by different conductors. And I'm listening for the slight nuances of difference between one conductor and another conductor in the same piece of music. Now, you might think that a piece of music, it's written down, all the notes are there. What scope is there? What room is there for difference? It couldn't be more clearly defined than being written down in black and white on a musical score. But of course, as we know, the performance by one soloist or the performance by one conductor can be quite different. It can be a different speed. It can have different emphases from another one. Just listen to this for a moment. I'm going to play you a song. Two versions of this song, which may be familiar to you. You can join in if you want to. See, same song, same words, same music. Could it actually be more different? So it's, you know, that's really what we're talking about. The fact that you can have something that is clearly written down, and yet you can have two versions of it, two different people, make it sound like a completely different work of art. Now, one thing that we'll be looking at a bit later on is the difference between originality and creativity. Sometimes we might think that those are the same thing, but actually they're not. As we'll see later, well, I won't say now because we'll see later, but just keep that example of those two songs in your mind as we go through. Now, if you have your list of sources, and again, if you're looking online at this, you can download the sources by clicking on the link that's just below the screen that you're looking at, as long as you haven't gone full screen. If you've gone full screen, go back, and just below the window where you can see me, you'll be able to see a link to download the sources. The first source, text 1, is from a writer called Leon Wieseltier. And he's thinking about the institution of Kaddish. Kaddish is the mourner's prayer that a mourner says for a year following the passing of a parent. But he compares the saying of Kaddish to the practicing by a dancer of dance moves. And this is what he says. I watch the dancers in the class and it strikes me that I can learn something about the shul from the studio. What these men and women are doing is not rote, it is practice, and there is nothing stultifying about practice. The purpose of practice is to repeat the elements of movement over and over, until they are absorbed into the body, until they precede reflection, so that they may be combined and recombined as the result of reflection into the dance. The formal and spiritual breakthroughs of the dance are these combinations and recombinations. Might this also be the case with study and prayer? Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the same words, the same symbols, the same themes. It is often objected against this view that creation cannot take place without tradition, that tradition frequently usurps creation, and so the diligent souls fail to fly. In the studio, however, I observe the diligent movements of these turning dancers, and yet they fly. I see that tradition must be an absorption, a second nature for creation to occur. So thinking about this excerpt, let's think about the following questions. What does the author notice about practicing dance moves? How does practice encourage creativity or self-expression? And do you think his insight does apply to prayer? You can feel free to chip in if you'd like to chip in, and you can feel free to type something if you're watching online. Do you think this is a good comparison or a false comparison? What he's saying is, what I take him to be saying, is the first time we say a prayer, it's unfamiliar to us. We might get hung up on the pronunciation of the words. We might be very focused on the meaning of the words. But when we say that prayer again, and we say it again, and we say it again, like the dance move being absorbed by the dancer's body, like a kind of a muscle memory, I think that's an expression that's used in that context, so we have a similar phenomenon with our prayers. They become, as it were, part of us, and then we can put into them whatever is in us that needs to be put into them. I don't know if you ever watched dancers practicing, but if you did, would you see them the same way that he sees them? What are they doing as they practice their moves? What actually is it about? And then thinking of your own experience and your own memories, can you think of an example in which rules or structure helped to spur your creativity? Not stifle it, but spur it. When it comes to religion, how can we express ourselves while remaining confined within certain rules? Which aspects of Jewish life encourage such self-expression? So those are some of the questions that this excerpt raises for us. The second text is from Rabbi Steinsaltz. Rabbi Steinsaltz is very closely connected with this whole Global Day of Learning project. The first year the project took place was to celebrate the completion of his commentary on the Talmud. And so he's been very closely connected with this whole Global Day of Learning since then. Indeed, throughout the year, he'll publish little articles, little questions on contemporary issues. So I think every one of the source notes for every topic, he has something to say. And this is what he has to say on this topic. Our whole romantic world subsists on the supposition that one should cultivate spontaneity of feeling and reject all rigid or clearly defined anticipation of spiritual or emotional experience. This attitude is not restricted to the religious life and is applied to other realms of feeling as well, such as romantic emotion and artistic creativity. It informs such concepts as love at first sight or artistic inspiration. In fact, it is precisely in these other realms that one can see the illusory quality of this romantic approach. Inspiration, as the primary source of artistic creativity, is no more than an attractive fiction, for spontaneity plays a relatively minor role in art, as it does in philosophical and scientific thinking. Creative action generally results from a combination of many factors, including subjective preparation, professional training, and a considerable amount of hard work. So if you imagine an author sitting down to write a novel, it's very, very rare that the entire structure of the book will pop into their head almost unbidden in a sudden flash of inspiration. That's not quite how it happens. Chances are this author will have gone to creative writing classes for some considerable time. They may have practiced and written some short stories. They'll have learned a great deal about narrative structure and character development and all of those other things. And all of these things they would have practiced until they have been able to do them almost without noticing. And then they may be ready to plan out and eventually write a novel. I think that's what he's saying when he talks about the preparation and the hard work. So, if we think about those two texts, the first one spoke about the practice of dances. Do you know where that noise is coming from? Ah, it's typing. Ah, okay. Right, that's where it's coming from. Okay, good. So a question has popped up. I'll come to that question in a moment. Let's just think a moment about the practice of the dancers on the one hand, and the considerable amount of hard work on the other hand. So when you think of your own attitude to these things, are you a romantic? When you think of things like artistic inspiration, do you think those things need to come unbidden suddenly? Or are you more practical in your outlook? And which approach do you think best fosters creativity? Is there any context where hard work could be considered romantic? What do you think? Hard work, romantic? I'll tell you why in other areas of my life, I'm a couples therapist, which some of you know. And there is a skill to maintaining and developing a relationship with somebody. There are numerous skills, actually, that are used. Some of us do it almost unconsciously. But the people that I work with, people who are having a bit of trouble with their relationship, they can learn these skills. And I get them to practice these skills. And sometimes they object. They say, but what about romance? What role does that have? Surely love is all you need. So, unfortunately, it's not. If it's not working, then it's clear that there are some skills, there are things that you can do to improve relationship, because it does respond and it is affected by the way in which we approach it. So let me just have a look at this question from New York, which has come in. It says, is there a problem in praying while I'm practicing the dance moves, so to speak, before I've internalized the meaning and the kavanah? Is there a problem in praying while I'm practicing the dance moves before I've internalized the meaning and the kavanah? I don't think so. I don't think there's an alternative, is there? I think it's the kind of thing that you have to sort of learn on the job, I would have thought. I don't know what anybody here thinks about it. But I don't think there's a phase where perhaps, when we're children, if we've had a Jewish education and we're being taught the prayers, maybe that's in preparation so that we can do the dance first time once we become adults. I think it's something that you just get better and better at the more you do it. That's the nature of practice. So there's a combination, and even a performer will say that if they've been short of performance, they get rusty. So it's something that I think we need to continue doing and continue practicing in order to keep our skills sharp. All right, so let's move on. Let's think about individuality and the study of Torah. The ability to express ourselves within a structured system applies to the entire Jewish tradition, but it may find its most powerful expression in the world of Torah study. Many have stressed how Judaism calls on each individual to study Torah rather than restricting the pursuit of religious knowledge to the priestly class. You may remember, if you've heard me speak before, that Rabbi Sachs, who's my teacher, writes about the phrase the Bible uses in referring to the Jewish people of Mamlechet Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. And he says, what does it mean to be a kingdom of priests? And he makes this very point, that in the ancient world, and actually in the not-so-ancient world, the skill of reading and writing, which gives the ability for independent study, was restricted to a priestly class. They were the only ones who were allowed to acquire these skills. They were the only ones who were able to have access to texts. It was thought dangerous to allow everybody to have these skills and access to these texts. That's never been the case in the Jewish world. And Rabbi Sachs says the phrase Mamlechet Kohanim, a kingdom of priests, means a literate kingdom. A kingdom where everybody can read, everybody can write, and everybody can study by themselves. And that's always been the ideal as far as the Jewish community is concerned. So we encourage all Jews to study certain basic texts, and everyone can choose a speciality. It might be Bible, it might be Talmud, it might be Jewish law or Jewish history. Some are interested in the Kabbalah. Moreover, a myriad of approaches exists within each discipline. For example, those studying Bible can utilize various techniques from rabbinic stories and literal readings to modern literary interpretation. And so, you know, those who come to the shir that we have on a Monday evening, we've used various techniques and various approaches over the years. We began by focusing on the text as explained by Rashi, and we would see the way in which Rashi, using the Midrash, would explain the text. In the last couple of years, we've been using the approach that's characterized by Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is very much a literary approach to understand why the Bible is written in the way that it's written, and why certain words are used, and why they're repeated, and what meaning they have, and this kind of an approach. So that's just within the first 5 books of the Bible. We've been studying it for several years, each year using a slightly different approach. Other people might want to look at the rest of the Bible, or the Mishnah, or the Talmud, and in any of those texts, one can use any number of different approaches. And why is that important? Well, if we look at the third text that we have, it will begin to become apparent. What this third text is about is the need for a person to find their own place in the world of Torah study. The excerpt is taken from the part of the Gemara called Avodah Zarah. It's a fairly lengthy passage. This is just a very short excerpt from it. But it's considering the first 2 verses of the book of Psalms, and the second verse in particular. Let's have a look at the text, and then we'll try and explain it and understand it. The second verse of the book of Psalms, so the second verse of the first psalm in the book of Psalms, contains the words Ki im besoros Hashem chefzo, which means a person whose desire is in the law of Hashem. What does this mean? Amar Rabbi. Rabbi says, Ein adam lomed Torah, ela mimakom shelibo chafetz. A person should only learn that part of Torah from which his heart's desire is found. Shneimar, as it says in this verse, Ki im b'toras Hashem chefzo. But whose desire is in the law of Hashem. And the Gemara then tells a story. We'll actually look at this story a little later on to illustrate that saying of Rabbi. And then his colleague Rava comes along and he says, no. He says, La'omar Rava, La'olam yilmod adam Torah, b'mokom shilabo chafetz. So if you compare those two sayings of Rabbi and Rava, you see they are identical except for the first letter of that word. One says mimokom and one says b'mokom. So mimokom means from the place and b'mokom means in the place that his heart desires. Shneimar, and he quotes the same verse, Ki im besoras Hashem chefzo. V'yamar Rava, and so Rava went on to explain, B'dechila, nikreis al shamo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ulabasof nikreis al shamo. In the beginning, the Torah is spoken of as belonging to the Holy One, blessed be He, but at the end, it is assigned to the person who studies it. Shneimar, as it says, B'toras Hashem chefzo, uv'soroso yege yomam v'layla. So it starts off by talking of Toras Hashem, but at the end of the verse it says, uv'soroso, His Torah is studied day and night. His meaning the person who's studying it. Now, what does this mean? On the surface, it means that Rabbi is saying that study works best when the student is studying a topic that they have chosen and that they're interested in and that delights them. So if you're studying something that you really want to study, that's the best way to study. Rava's expression we'll explain in a moment or two. But let's consider this idea of Rabbi first of all. Is it right that study works best when you're studying something that you want to? Well, clearly there are advantages to it. You'll be more motivated to study something you have a genuine interest in. And therefore, the study may well be more successful, because if you're more motivated, you'll put in more effort, you'll put in more time, you'll put in more dedication, and therefore it makes sense to study something that you're particularly interested in. Are there any problems with that approach? Well, the obvious problem is there are whole areas of Jewish law that a person needs to know about. What if a person's just not interested in learning the laws of kashrut? What, so they shouldn't learn it? They shouldn't know how to keep a kosher home? They've got no interest? See, it's a problem. There are certain things we have to learn, whether we want to learn them or not, because otherwise we won't know how to live properly as a Jewish person. So, whilst the ideal may be to study something that we really want to study, it's a bit limited, and it won't suffice for us for everything that we need to know. Now, the text number 4 is from the Maharsha. Now, the Maharsha, Rabbi Shmuel Edels, is a commentator on the Talmud. He lived in the 16th century in Poland, and he comments on the passage that we've just read from Avodah Zarah. And he explains the difference between the phrase mimoko and b'moko, from the place and in the place. One of them, the first one, mimoko, refers to the subject matter that the student is learning. But the other one, b'moko, speaks of the teacher and the institution that the person goes to do their learning. And so he alters the choice of words, reflecting the importance in both the choice of subject and the choice of teacher. In both cases, we see the significance of following one's inclination in the world of educational choices. And apparently, academic flourishing depends upon excitement and enthusiasm for the material in question. So this is what the Maharsha says. B'mokom shelibo chafetz, he says, Kvar amar Rabbi Le'el, B'mokom shelibo chafetz. We've already seen Rabbi say above that this phrase, from the place that a person's heart desires, the hainu me'eza meseches v'sefer u'kedemasik, whichever tractate, whichever book a person wants to be occupied with, but here, amar bomakom, the base. But here it says the word bomakom in the second phrase, with the letter base on the front, not the letter mem, hainu, which means eitzel ezer rav shilibo chofetz, with whichever teacher his heart desires. V'chein hu b'yalkut b'divrei rava, and we find in the Yalkut, in the collection of Midrash, in the name of Rava, mimi shilibo chofetz. It even changes the word from mimokum to mimi, from whom his heart desires. So, according to the Maharshal, the personalization of Torah study relates to students selecting both a teacher they connect to and the subject matter that speaks to them. I remember long ago I was asked by a rather desperate father whose son didn't want to really learn anything Jewish. He was a bit turned off. And the father recruited me and he said, I want you to give my son some lessons in Hebrew knowledge. I don't care what he wants to learn. You find out from him what he wants to learn. Whatever he wants to learn, teach him. Turned out the boy wanted to learn. He'd heard about and he wanted to learn the various methods of execution that are described in the Mishnah in Sanhedrin, which was somewhat gory. If you've ever learned that part of the Mishnah, it goes into some detail as to how these various methods of execution were carried out. That's what he wanted to learn. I said to his father, are you sure this is the right thing? He said, if that's what he wants to learn, teach him that. So it's all Mishnah, it's all Torah, and so that was a personal experience I had of this principle, that whatever a person wants to learn, just learn. There's enough to learn, there's enough for everybody to learn. So whatever a person wants to learn, let them learn. As far as the teacher is concerned, I always had this practice at school, and I've always advised all of my children. It was advice that I was always told not necessarily even with Jewish studies, with secular studies as well. The advice that was always given was choose the subject you want to study. And I always thought that was daft. I always thought that was stupid. I always chose my teacher, because there are some teachers that can make anything interesting. It doesn't matter what the subject they're teaching. They're talented teachers. They can whatever they're teaching will be interesting, and I'd be interested by it. And so I always chose by teacher. I mean, it didn't do me any good. I did terribly at school, but that was my principle. That was my method, and it's a method that I've advised my own sons to do as well, because what's important in learning is an enthusiasm for the subject. A motivation in the subject, and a good teacher will do that. A good teacher will get you motivated, will make it interesting, even if it's, you know, I've got one son who's become passionate about accountancy and adding up figures and balance sheets, and that because he had a good teacher who made the subject interesting. I can't think of anything more dull, but he made it interesting. I know you like it, but it was found to be he found it interesting. So I mentioned before that if you've got a comment to make, come and make it at the microphone so everybody can hear around the world. I mentioned before that there's a little story that illustrates the first saying of Rabbi that was excised from our excerpt of the Mishnah. It's presented here as text number 5, and it reads as follows: Levi Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Yosvei Kamei de Rabbi. Levi and Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi, were sitting in the presence of Rabbi, B'Karpaski Sidra, and they got to the end of the bit of whatever it was that they were learning. They finished it. Solik Sifra, so it was taken away, and then they had to choose what they were going to study next. So Levi said, Laisi Lon Mishle, I'd like to learn the book of Proverbs. Rabbi Shimon Rabbi said, Laisi Lon Tilim, I want to learn the book of Psalms. Kfir Levi, he imposed his will on Levi, Vaisi Tilim, and a book of Tehillim was brought, Psalms, not Proverbs. So when they came to this, I mean, if you remember what I said, this verse that we quoted in the Gemara is the second verse in the whole book of Psalms, right? So it didn't take them very long. They came to this verse, Ki im besaras Hashem chavtso, whatever a person's heart desires. Perush, Rabbi v'amar. So Rabbi explained it, and he said, Ein adam lo Torah ela b'mokem shelibo chavetz. A person should only learn that bit of Torah which his heart desires. Omar Levi. So Levi said, Rabbi, Nasata lanu rishus lamod. You've given me the excuse or the reason to get up and leave, because you've just said a person should learn what they want to learn. I've clearly said I want to learn Proverbs. Here we are learning Psalms. The second verse in the book of Psalms says I don't have to do this. I don't want to do this. So, see ya. I'm off. I don't know whether he actually did get up and leave or whether they just had a bit of a laugh about it. But that's the story that is told in the Gemara after that saying of Rabbi to illustrate the topic. So think back to your own study. Think back to when a time, did you ever have to study something that you didn't really want to study? And what I see some nods around the room. I mean, what was that like? What's it like having to study something that you really don't want to study? It's a slog.
It's a challenge.
It's a challenge.
You can find 1,000 reasons to be doing something else.
Yeah, that's right. You'll find 1,000 reasons to do something else. You go and make a cup of coffee, you'll check what the weather is, yeah, that's right. So, if we're talking about something as important as Torah, something which should form part and parcel of a person's life, that's not the attitude that we want really to develop. And that's why Rabbi comes along and says, no, go with what you're interested in. Follow your interest. Find a teacher that you like learning with. Find a topic that you like learning. If you can combine those two things, so much the better. That's the best way to learn Torah. So, let's move on to part 3. Torah study, creativity, and novel insights. Until now, we've discussed finding one's place in Torah study in terms of subject matter, interpretative approaches, and teachers. Another prominent way to personalize Torah is to strive towards creative interpretations and novel insights. Indeed, much of Jewish traditional learning culture highly values the chidush, the innovative idea. In the following story, Rabbi Elazar ben Chasma refuses to accept the idea that his disciples could only listen to him and could not tell him some new idea that emerged in the academy study. My very first experience of yeshiva learning was in Gateshead. There's a big yeshiva in Gateshead in the north of England, and they, I don't know if they still do, they used to run a week's course for people who, like me, didn't come from a very strong Jewish background in terms of Jewish learning and practice. So they gave you like a taste a week. You could go and find out what it was like. And I remember somebody explaining to me the different levels of shiur that existed in the yeshiva. There was the starters, the beginners level, and then once you had acquired a certain competence in handling the text, and then you go up to the next level, and so on and so forth, until you got to the top level. And in the top level, you were expected, on every passage, every what we call sugya, every passage of the Talmud that was studied, you were expected to produce a chiddush, some new insight, some new way, some new question with an appropriate answer that no one had thought of before, or that you weren't aware that anybody had thought of before. We'll see in a moment that whether or not someone had thought of it before isn't really the point. You weren't aware that someone had thought of it before, and you had invented it. So, and I remember being dumbstruck. How can you do that? I mean, the Talmud has been studied for thousands of years. How can anyone think that they'll still be able to think of something new after all this time, and all these thousands of geniuses who've been studying it all this time and have delved into it? And how can a mere human being think that they will be able to think of something new? Well, we have this passage from the Talmud from Chagiga, which reads as follows. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught, Ma'aseh Rabbi Yochanan ben Baroka, Rabbi Elazar ben Chasma, shehalchu lahakbil pnei Rabbi Yehoshua b'Pekiah. The rabbis told a story about Rabbi Yochanan ben Barucha, Rabbi Elazar ben Chasma, who were going to visit Rabbi Yehoshua in Pekiah. Amalehem. So they said to him, he said to them, Ma chidush haya b'veis hamedrash haya. He said, no, so what's new? What's new in the Beis Medrash today? Amru lo. So they said to him, Tamidecha anu. We are your pupils. We're your students. Umemecha anu shosim. We drink from your waters. The Torah is often compared to waters. They said to him, we're your students. We learn from you. You can't learn from us. How can you expect us to tell you something new? Amalehem. So he said to them, Afa pikein. Even so, ef shala beis hamedrash below chidush. You can't. There's no such thing. It's impossible to have such a thing as a Beis Medrash with no Kiddush. A house of learning where there isn't something new, that can't exist. I can't imagine a house of learning where they don't have something new. So he prompted them, and he said, Shabbos shel mi hoysa. Whose week was it? Whose week was it this week? What he's referring to is the period, if you know a little bit of Talmudic history, at one time, the Nasi was Rabbi Yochanan ben Gamliel. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Gamliel acted in a very harsh way towards Rabbi Yehoshua, to the extent that the sages of the Sanhedrin said, we're not putting up with this. And they removed him as Nasi. And they were then stuck with the problem, well, who's going to be Nasi? Nobody wanted to step into the shoes of Rabbi Yochanan ben Gamliel. And so they appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who at the time was 18 years of age, and we make reference to this in the Passover Haggadah, in the Pesach night, Seder night Haggadah. We have a saying of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Ani kaven shivim shona. I'm like someone 70 years old. Because the Talmud tells us that a miracle happened. He was 18 years of age at the time, and that's why with the impetuosity of youth he took on the position. But to give him some gravitas, in able to stand in front of all the collected rabbis and speak with authority, a miracle happened and he sprouted a long grey beard overnight. And so he said, I'm like someone 70 years old. He actually was 18, but he was like someone of 70. Well, this situation only lasted for a relatively short period of time, and time came for Rabbi Yochanan ben Gamliel to be rehabilitated and reinstated. But they felt bad for Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. They didn't want to just push him aside and he would feel that he'd been kind of used as a stopgap. And so they instituted this system where Rabbi Yochanan ben Gamliel would be the Nasi for 3 weeks, and on the 4th week, Elazar ben Azariah would serve in that role. And that's the question that Rabbi Yehoshua is asking. Whose week is it? Is it one of the 3 weeks of Yochanan, I've forgotten. Shimon ben Gamliel, I don't know, whatever. Ben Gamliel. Is it one of his 3 weeks, or is it Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's week? So they answered, Shabbos Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. It was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's week. And what did he tell you today? Amrulo. So they said to him, B'Parshas Hakel. He told us about, remember the mitzvah of Hakel that's mentioned right at the end of the Torah, that every 7 years the whole congregation had to be joined together. And the Gemara goes on to tell them the lesson that he taught them about Hakel, that we can understand the men being there, we can understand the women being there. Why are the children there? The children are only there so that their parents get the merit for bringing them. You remember I mentioned this in a Joshua a little while ago, I think on Sukkot, didn't I? Was it on Sukkot? I think on Sukkot. So he prompts them, he urges them, he nudges them, and eventually they tell him this Kiddush that they had learned. Because the idea that you will learn Torah and not have some new insight or some new lesson, that's something that's inconceivable to Rabbi Yehoshua. So, that shows that every person who learns Torah is perfectly entitled to ask a question, to offer an insight, to give an interpretation, to say, I think it means this, I wonder why it says that. Everybody's entitled. Everybody has been taught to read. Everybody is obligated to learn. And learning means understanding, and understanding means asking questions. And delving and giving you insights. That's what learning is. So we now come to the difference that I mentioned at the beginning between creativity and originality. The celebration of creativity need not refer only to ideas never said before. Even serious thinkers rarely come up with an idea that has no precedent whatsoever. Yet this doesn't mean that they lack the chance for creativity. Firstly, we could often add a new perspective to an older idea. More importantly, the creative gesture does not depend on unprecedented novelty. So in text number 7, we have a fairly modern piece of writing, just 13 years ago. Rabbi Shalom Karmi, who's the editor, I think now, of the journal Tradition, which is the journal that's put out by the Rabbinical Council of America. He outlines a helpful distinction between creativity and originality. Being original means saying something never said before. Originality is essential when patenting an invention, and it must be exhibited or feigned for academic advancement. And it is, of course, useful in attracting attention to oneself. Creativity, by contrast, reflects the inner experience of the individual overcoming a challenge. Creativity is not diminished when one achieves, by strength and submission, what has already been discovered by men whom one cannot hope to emulate. To contend with a sugya or a passage of Tanakh and forge in the smithy of one's consciousness the same understanding that animated Ramban or Sforno or Rabbi Shimon Shkop is a triumph of human creativity. And that's why I said, when I was speaking a moment ago about the top shir in the yeshiva, where they had to come up with a chiddush, it didn't matter if someone had said it. On the contrary, there is a phrase that's used in circles of Jewish learning, Baruch Shekivanti. Blessed be he who has preempted me in saying such and such. Because if I think hard about a problem, and I have the merit to say something, and then I find that one of the classic commentators has asked exactly the same question that I've asked, that doesn't diminish my creativity. Well, I haven't said something that's completely original, but it was original for me. I thought I wasn't aware that somebody else had asked the question. And finding that someone else has asked the question, that encourages me that I was on the right lines as one of these geniuses of earlier times. So that's the difference between creativity and originality. If you think back to those two pieces of music I played you at the beginning, the second one, the first one, is both creative and original. That particular melody, those particular words, had never been combined in quite that way before. So that was both creative and original. And that was the Beatles. The second one, the Joe Cocker one, well, that wasn't original. All the words were there. All the music was there. But was it creative? Well, it was surely creative. Because although that melody had been put to those words before, it hadn't been put to me quite that way. You might say neither before nor since. And that was the creativity of that particular arrangement. And so that's really what we need to hold on to. Because Jewish tradition does place limits. It does place boundaries. There are things that are permitted and there are other things that are not permitted. And so we operate within what we call the Arba Amot of Halakha, the 4 cubits of Halakha. Those are our parameters. That's our territory. that we operate within from a halachic perspective. But within that territory, there's any number of questions that we can ask, any number of new insights that we might have, any number of connections that we can make between one thing and another thing. That's often due to the poetic nature of the Hebrew language, having, as it does, so few roots of words. Many words have resonances of other words, and we might notice a resonance, make a connection that we're not aware has been made before. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. So if you think of someone whose creativity you admire, and think about in what ways that person is creative. And think about, are they original? Or are they creative in taking things that are already there and just combining them in an original way? Are there ways in which you are creative in your approaches to Jewish tradition? I remember in this very room I heard a very creative thing. Do you remember when we were sitting on the Shabbos lunch before Pesach, and we were going through the Seder Night Haggadah, and when we came to the karpas, I went around the room and asked, what vegetables do you use to dip into the salt water at the beginning of the Seder? Some people use parsley, some people use celery, other people use a radish, some have a potato. And one person said, I started using a banana. I'd never heard of anybody using a banana before. I said, why on earth do you use a banana? He said, well, because then the children say, why on earth are you using a banana? I said, well, that is exactly the spirit of the Seder. That's creative. It's fully within the halacha. It's a type of foodstuff on which you say the bracha b'rei pri ha'adama. That's the only criterion for the karpas. Because in the high, use a banana. That's creativity within halacha. So, we saw that the Talmud in the Avodah Zarah speaks of taking God's Torah and making it yours. Some of us may do so by suggesting a novel insight. Others will deepen their own understanding and internalize significant ideas. Both reflect authentic creativity and the personalizing of religious experience. Though many Jews share the identical mitzvah of Torah study, each Jew can find a place for individuality and creativity within this commandment. And that's our challenge. The mitzvah is there. The command has been given. It's for us to take that mitzvah and to make it our own. And that's the challenge that we have. And that may be a difficult thing to do. That's where the creativity comes in. To find a way and find an approach to this particular mitzvah that no one else has found before. To say, well, I'm going to study this text, or I'm going to study this bit of history, or I'm going to study, but I'm going to do it from this perspective, because this is where my interest lies. And if you're fortunate enough to find an inspirational teacher, well, then you've got the full house. But the key thing is to take your Torah study, to take your study of the Torah, and make it something, as we saw in the excerpt about the dancers, make it something that sets your soul in flight. Because that's really the purpose. The purpose of learning, the purpose of growing in your development and appreciation of Torah and everything that it has to teach us, is to give flight to our souls, that we can soar ever upwards in our service of our divine Creator, who, after all, is the source of all knowledge. Thank you very much.